Evacuation of Jersey in 1940 and what led up to it. Well, in 1939, at the time of Dunkirk, a fleet of boats left Jersey to go to St. Malo to pick up troops from St. Malo and bring them back to Jersey. And that was done quite successfully. One of the chaps that was on that was Danny Morrow and his boat, the Girl Joyce. I don't know the others except there was Mr. Le. I didn't know him, never ever met him, and he ended up as the bailiff of Jersey, I believe. Then everything went quiet after the bombing, and then sometime later, people started to evacuate and leave Jersey and go to England. And the States had got boats to go take people away. But you had to get like a ticket to get on the boat. Well, the queue reached from the town hall all the way around to the opera house. So that was a virtually half a mile long, the queue, and it was thick. And my dad stood in that queue, and he stood in there overnight and didn't really move very much. When he eventually got the tickets to go and he got back home, my mum, Nellie, had been having a chat with the lady next door. And the lady next door was hanging the washing out. And my mum said to her, "What the heck are you hanging the washing out for, leaving the Germans clean clothes?" And the lady said, I was a refugee in the First World War, and once you start running, you never stop. So I've decided to let the Germans run over me this time. Well, what happened, we stayed in Jersey, but Margaret's family, they all left. And how they come to leave, they lived in St. Mark's Road in Jersey, and they all walked down to the boat. And on the way down, there's a shoemaker in Burrard Street at that time, and he gave Margaret's mum either a £5 or a £10 note. And one of the things she did when she returned after the war was to return that £10. Very good to that bootmaker. But the family got down to the docks, and the old man had got his bike with him, and all the family got aboard the boat except him, and he was standing on the dock with his bike against the crane. And one of the stevedores saw him and said, "You jump on the boat, go with the family." So he jumped on board. He must have actually jumped on board from the harbour itself. Well, when they got to Weymouth, or wherever they eventually got to in England, they went up to Barnsley. I can't tell you exactly what they were put up in Weymouth for a while. And from there, they went up to Barnsley. And the family got split up in all sorts of directions. But the twins stayed together. That was Roy and Margaret. And they stayed with a very good lady who Margaret kept in touch with right till the old lady died. Because she'd acted like a second mom to her. Because at that time, Margaret could have only been about 5 or 6 at that particular time, 1940. Well, during the war period, Edna joined the ATS. I'm not too sure what Erica was doing, but she was in some form of services. Ivy worked in munitions, and all her hands got working with acids and that got all blistered and really had a bad effect on her skin for life, in fact. Well, they were there for 5 years. Like the boys were all split up in different places. And one of the things that after the war, when at Dennis's funeral in Guernsey, I was with Alfred on the top of the seawall, overlooking the sea in Guernsey, and there were tears running down his face. And I said, "Well, what's going through your mind?" And he said, "Do you know, since the occupation, I've never really known Dennis because we got split up in the war. Then during the war, he eventually joined the army. Dennis joined the army. So they never really, and then Dennis eventually went to Sark as the baker and married Pam there. And so the connection, the evacuation was a disaster for the Le Goubin family because they were all split up and never really got together again. Which really, it's only when you look back on it, you realize what a tragedy it was to that particular family. Whereas us in Jersey, Mom, Dad, Shirley and I, we were here in Jersey all through the occupation, and fortunately, nothing really happened to us that except a shortage of food during the war period. So we were very, very fortunate. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Le Goubin, Mr. Le Goubin was a baker, and he was an expert in doing lattice work on cakes, wedding cakes, the lattice work and all the decorations. And he worked for Rivs in Snow Hill. But he was a little tiny chap, quite pleasant, very, very strict with Margaret, over strict in a way. Yeah, very much over strict. But he had a very nice grandfather clock, which he gave to one of his bakers. Today, that grandfather clock would be worth a fortune. But he gave it to one of his mates in the bakery before he died. Old Mrs. Le Goubin was rather a very, very docile lady, very quiet spoken. She was part of the Hunt family, who were the pawnbrokers, I suppose you should say, in Conway Street, and a very old firm. And they were all ship's chandlers, perhaps as it was originally. But still, that's where some of their money came from, because they originally lived in St Mark's Road during the war, before the war, and then after the war we moved back into St Mark's Road, then bought the house in Green Road called Summerland, and they were very happy there. I'm sure the old couple. Margaret had the little bedroom there, and I used to see Jersey Motor Panels was just on the road that goes through to Margaret's house, and I used to often see her, Charlie Malquois and myself. We used to always whistle at the girls as they went by, past the garage. It was one of the things, chaffing at the Charlie Malquois was a chap who worked for us, and he was very badly bomb damaged as a person, very, very bad stutter, but a hang of a nice chap. And I worked with him at Jersey Motor Panels. But there was in Ryburn Avenue 2 barrels and gun poles across, so that to stop the traffic going through that particular area. Well, Margaret used to ride her bike between these barrels, and she used to do it at speed, but not always. Once she hit the barrels, and so we had to go and give her a hand up. Then how I really met Margaret was I'd walked into town, and at Snow Hill, I saw Margaret standing at the bus stop in Lamont Street. So I joined the bus queue and got on the bus and sat next to her and made a date. And the first date we had was at we went to the Forum, which was a show on there. And I got my first kiss there in the car there in our old Morris years ago. That sums up the really the part of the war where the early part. During the war period, the Germans here built hundreds and hundreds of concrete bunkers, dozens and dozens, all linked up with tunnels, and so they were well protected. Well, one day I was at Millard's Corner, or just near there, and there was a bunker there, and a Spitfire flew over along the coast road, and there was a German officer in the middle of the road with his pistol out, firing at the Spitfire. But of course he didn't hit it. He was too slow. Also, another plane crashed outside. The Germans shot their own plane down because they were. That was in about 1944, where after D-Day and that, and the Germans were very edgy. So this plane came over the top of Fort Regent and flew low, and the Germans just opened up and knocked it out of the sky, and it broke up opposite Brigadon in a field. And all us kids got there the next day to see the wreck. And we would crawl. The Germans were guarding it, of course, and they would shoot wooden bullets at us if they saw us. They had instead of having ordinary, they just had wooden caps in that. And us kids knew all the tricks, as you might say, in those days. And I went with a pair of snips and cut a piece of the plane off. But the crew got killed in that aircraft. It was just one of the Germans shot their own plane down. And there was another plane, a Spitfire, was shot down over the Swears farm that was on the St. Martin's Road. It was just a stray aircraft that happened to come across. Then there was one Spitfire that got shot down over St. Bernard's Bay. And that Spitfire landed in the bay, and the pilot was still in the plane, and a chap picked up a float. A float is was like a catamaran, two floats with three boards across, and he swam out and he rescued the pilot out of the aircraft with this float, and he rescued the pilot. I don't know whether he was recognized for that piece of, but the Germans, when they took prisoners or there was anybody got killed, they had real funerals, which were all military honors and all sorts of things. Now, talking about graveyards, so at Howard Davis Park, there was a ship went down near Guernsey, and I think it was an American warship, and a lot of the crew got washed up on Jersey. So they were buried in Howard Davis Park. And there must have been close on 50 to 100 graves here. Now, the Germans had a graveyard, which was at St. Bernard's in the churchyard there. And that was also quite a remarkable looking at that time. It was like it could have been a tourist attraction, if that's what you can call a graveyard. But the one in Howard Davis Park still exists. the Germans actually removed all those people, and they were taken back to Germany. And there must have been 50 or 60 graves in some large of Germans that died in the island during the war. There were people who escaped from Jersey during the war. It was after D-Day, and they would escape to France. And Dougie Lemachon, who lived at number 1, the avenue just across the road from me, and four of them, Lemachon and that, they had a boat and they left, and they opened up the outboard motor too fast, and by doing that, the back of the boat went down and the engine went underwater, and they came back, and the Germans heard them, and they opened up with a machine gun, and they caught Dougie Marshall. He lost his life there. But what part of that was that we'd given a letter to Dougie Lemachon, and it was found on his body, this letter. And the Germans rang up the workshop, because the only name they could read was they could only read my signature, because my mom and dad had signed the letter Nellie and Tom. But I wrote Trevor Hodgskin, signed it like I was a schoolboy at the time, I suppose 14, and rather thoughtless of me at that time. So they phoned the workshop, and no, that's not right. They phoned the house, and my mum answered the phone, and the guys in the workshop, Eli and that, always were pulling my mom's leg, joking with her over different things. And when this German came onto the phone, she said, "You're kidding me," and then he read the letter out to her, and then she realized that no one else knew about the letter. Well, what happened, they ended up at a court case with the under King's Cliff, and the Marine magistrate, or whatever you would like to call him, German war court. And my dad was given 6 weeks or a fine of so many marks. And my mum was given a fine, either a month or a fine. I can't remember exactly what the fine was, but they paid the fine. It was in Reichsmarks, so it didn't matter. They paid the fine. But my mum used to go and pay it. When they came out of the court, the clerk of the court, or the clerk behind the scenes, could speak perfect English. And he said to my mum and dad, he said, my mum and dad are in America. And he said, if I was to have done, I appreciate what you've done, but if I did it, the results would be very, very much different, which meant he would have been shot for doing it. So Mom used to take the fine, and this bloke said they could pay in installments. So they paid the fine in installments, and the last installment was at the end of the war. So it was quite crazy, but they paid the money at College House, and Mom had a dog, and she used to take the dog, give it a kick, so it'd run up and down the corridors making a nuisance of itself. Typical of my mom. Yeah, that's the period of during the wartime. What else? Then we came to the liberation, which was a wonderful period also. Then Margaret came back. I didn't meet Margaret until about 1948. And, or may have been 1949, about that time. The lads in Jersey that I was friendly with was mainly Peter Louis, who lived at Fawley and Kingsley Avenue, and all the boys around here. There was Freddie Davis, Billy Burt, Ronnie Burt, Clive Isaacs. I think most of them have passed on now. All that crowd, Clive Letemplier, they've all gone. Well, I mean, I'm 90 now, nearly 90 now, so I'm very fortunate to be still here. Then I worked at Jersey Motor Panels in learning to be a sheet metal worker come panel beater, because my dad was a fabulous craftsman, and he died in about 1950. No, I've gone. But he was 59 when he died, and he had the burst main artery to the heart had burst, and he was flown to England, and he died in St Thomas's Hospital there. And my mom was there. I flew over from Bulawayo to my mom in London. But, you know, I didn't take it in at the time that my dad had gone. I'd been away from home for so long then, 10 or so years, that the connection wasn't good, if you know what I mean. I left my dad and my mom, but it took me a year to realize he'd gone. You know, it's funny. It's a thing I think of nowadays, that the human mind is sometimes a little bit disorientated. Well, we came back to Jersey after that, and I don't know how long I stayed in Jersey, but then I returned back to Bulawayo. But how I came to Rhodesia was have I spoken about that before? But Frank LeBrun and Mr. Voce and all got high regards of Rhodesia, and Jack Longwell came into the workshop after he came back and said the place was hot, dusty, and after 6 weeks he went back to Rhodesia, and I followed him, and I stayed with Doc Croxford in 64 National Avenue.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Before you go on to that, I think let's do that in a future session. But if you just go back, I just was very interested in what you're saying about the infrastructure that the Germans put into Jersey, and what the impact of that is on the total war. And then maybe you could talk about your involvement in Jersey Motor Panels and what sort of skills what it was like working for your parents and what skills you learned, etc.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Go. The Germans put in miles and miles of concrete, tons and tons of concrete here, and they got all the sand from Grouville, and they built a railway line which came through the back of the FB fields, all the way from Gorey, through and all the way to St Wallens, and because the sand at Grouville was ideal for concrete. Well, those bunkers, and there must be literally thousands of bunkers on the islands, Jersey and Guernsey, and Alderney is the biggest fortress other than Gibraltar when it comes to the size of it. But none of the guns were ever fired in anger, and but the effect of all that concrete, if that concrete had been put into all along the coast of France, the war would have been totally different to what it was. In fact, it's been said that the mere fact that Hitler had got this obsession with the Channel Islands and all the concrete here, that it was our part of the war was just having the concrete here instead of on the coast of France, and it made a very big difference. And this is what the historians say. It's not what I say. That the effect on the outcome of the war was really due to Hitler putting so much in the bunkers here. But the Germans here in the Channel Islands, they were really on holiday. This was a wonderful place. The Germans even come back here after the war for holidays, which it sounds funny that the conquerors come back just to visit the place. But I spoke of Erebert the other day. Now he ended up as a priest, but at D-Day, he went to St. Thomas's Church and left his rifle outside, and he was arrested as he came out. And of course, all the motor trade knew this chap Erebert, and the tale went round that he'd been arrested. So he was a good bloke in all through his life, I suppose, when you come to think of it. But the bunkers, they're still open now. We've got what we call the Occupation Society here, and it was originated by a chap called Mr. Jims, but it's very, very active, and they open the bunkers to tourists to see them. And we got a tunnel here. The people that really got badly hurt here were the Russians, prisoners, and they kept them in camps, and they didn't feed them very well, and they were a sorry state to see. In fact, when they were doing the railway line at Greve here, I took some garlic down to give to them, and I got absolutely mobbed by people, all these Russians trying to get the food that I was giving. I just crawled out from underneath the mob and run away. I was scared stiff of these people. They were all in rags and tatters, and they were carrying the railway lines on their shoulders and putting them down. And it was quite a frightening thing to see these people. The Gestapo, or it wasn't really the Gestapo, it was some sort of field police, were here in the island at Silvertide, and everybody joked about it, the fact that they were there. But you knew who they were, because they used to wear these, like a leather overcoat, long coat, and it's beautiful, really beautiful leather, and you knew who they were right away. They, sort of just their appearance gave them away. The main man there was Mr. Wolfe. Now, further down the road, there was a house called Bagnall's. Now, there was a car park there, and one of Germany's most famous racing drivers had got his picture in the back of the car. He used to drive the auto unions. I've forgotten his name now, but those are the sort of things you see and you remember. Yeah, remember very well. But Mr. Lane used to fish and he used to feed the fish before he went fishing, and he would get this stuff they call shervy, and they were really sandhoppers off the beach, and he'd mix it all up in a pot and go down to the Collet Rocks or the Dyke Rocks, feed the fish with the shervy for 2 or 3 days, and then he would come along with the same stuff, and the fish would go for his hooks. He would get 10 or 20 fish, whereas everybody else got nothing. It was quite an amazing sight to see him get so many fish. Yeah. Um, no,
Just,
I
just
finished
if
for a
you go
minute.
back to Jersey Motor Panels and what you
Okay,
did there.
right. Well, I started at Jersey Motor Panels. I must have, well, I used to go to Jersey Motor Panels all the time because it was like a second home, even when I was still at school. I mean, when they blew up the Palace Hotel, the Germans blew up the Palace. There was a mutiny here where the Army or the Navy blew up the Palace Hotel. Now, I was in the workshop at the time and I was filing away at the bench, and all the glass in front, because it was an old greenhouse, it all tinkled down. You know, it was so, was such a big explosion. It was about a mile away as well. And the place was on fire. And us kids, in the afternoon, we went up through Bago Manor Farm to where the Palace Hotel was. We could only get within a field away from it. There were a couple of fields really away. And there were Germans running on the roofs. They couldn't get out of there. You know, they couldn't get down. So what happened to them, I don't know. But all this bits and pieces of crockery and uh, were thrown all over the place. In fact, I had 2 or 3 bits of stuff from the Palace Hotel explosion. It was a very big one. That was the army against the navy. At least that's what I thought it was. And that's what the story I got told. But you got many stories about these different things. All right.
And then Jersey Motor Panels,
Well,
how was it? What was it like working for your
at
parents?
Jersey Metal Panels, I used to go in and work there. I worked in Bago Road for a while and helped my dad repairing different things as a crash repairman, I suppose, mostly, because there wasn't an awful lot after the war of new things being built. And we eventually managed to get Stadium Works, which was where the vets are now. And it was a very big workshop. Now, we could have bought that workshop for £11,000, but my mother was not a person that borrowed money. And if she'd have bought that place for 11,000, we'd have paid it off over a short period, over a relatively short period, and because you could take out um, loans for 20 years or something like that, and but they never borrowed money at all. In fact, the first house that my mother ever bought was Maison St. Louis for my sister. And she lived in rented property all through her life of Les Sailors until she was very old, and she went to live with Shirley at Maison St. Louis. Well, I worked in the garage and as a metal worker, but then every time somebody in the radiator shop left the firm, I ended up in the radiators. Well, in the winter, the water's bloody cold. Um, express it. You know, you break the ice off the top of the tank, and you were testing the radiators underwater, and the fluxes in those days were quite strong, and it always attacked the back of your neck. You know, you rub it, and you rubbing in the acid into your scalp, sort of style. It really radiator work was really not a very pleasant job in the early days, with all the fluxes and the testing and that. Well, I ended up that I must have had words with my folks, and so they opened a little workshop for me on my own in Halkett Place, which was opposite the Mechanics Institute. And that's where I first met Frank. Well, I didn't meet him for the first time because I knew him from racing, motor racing. And but it wasn't very satisfactory because it was just after the war. There was no telephones and no telephone lines, and we were only about 75 yards from the telephone exchange. But that's there. It was from there I closed that shop up. Wasn't successful financially or anyway at all. But then I went back to the main workshop. But of course, I ended up doing radiators again and learning a bit of the metal work as well at the same time. At that time, Ivor, who was married to Shirley, my sister, Ivor Lehman. My sister Shirley, she went to the collegiate school and in Jersey, and then she went to work at the potteries in Goree for Major Potter. There she met Ivor, and eventually they got married. But I must tell you a story. We were going to France one day, and Ivor was in a boarding house in Goree village, and we rushed Ivor, and he's got a beautiful mop of hair, Ivor did, and he was in the bathroom all of a tear, and he rubbed stuff into his head, and afterwards he looked at a tube that he got, and he'd rubbed feet, there's hair remover into his hair. So he was nearly missed the boat due to Ivor getting his hair all washed up again. They got married when we were in Zimbabwe. My mum, or Rhodesia, my mum and dad came out to our wedding, and Margaret came out. I think this is a different story, but I left Jersey in March, I think March the 17th, 1953, and I arrived in Cape Town, had a very nice trip out on the Carnarvon Castle, and for £75, it was a very wonderful trip, really, and met a lot of people and made some good friends, people that I knew for ages on. There was one chap there that used to work for a firm called Gull and Kimpton in Bulwer, and they'd just done a Cape to Cairo in a Citroen. It was from one Cape to the other Cape by road. So it was nice, absolutely lovely people on board. Then I went by train. When the chap at Cape Town grabbed all my baggage and put it down onto his cart. But of course, when I first arrived, there was an African, and all these Africans to me at that time, they all looked the same. I couldn't tell the difference who'd taken my luggage. But eventually I found it, got on the train for 3 days up to Bulwer, and that's where Jack Longwell and Robert Croxford met me. Robert Croxford now is a photographer in Cornwall somewhere. And the first night, I stayed at Napier Avenue, 64 Napier Avenue, at Doc Croxford's house. And then I made arrangements to stay at the Sussex Hotel, and I shared a room there. I think it was £16 a month that I paid rent for that. And that was including meals. So that was cheap, when you come to think of it, in those days. And I worked at various firms there. I was never very successful in Bulwer in the early days. I don't know. I worked at Crombie's first of all, and Crombie's But first of all, I'd had to apply to Rhodesia House to get with references and accommodation and all that. Um, they before I could get a ticket, and when I got, you had to get the permission to come to Rhodesia in those days, and I shared a room with this one chap, and it was only a small room, 2 beds in it, and a little tiny wardrobe, and I went to bed, say at 9 o'clock, and the other bloke hadn't arrived. And in the morning, when I looked down, there was a pile of beer bottles. There must have been at least 15 beer bottles all stacked up. That was the type of individual you could end up sharing a room with in those days. But I stayed there at the Sussex Hotel, I suppose, for at least 9 months. And then I moved into with Dr. Croxford's because John Croxford died, and he was very ill. He'd got a liver complaint. He got a yellow complexion, and then see Jack Longwell, his wife came out, Mrs. Longwell. Mrs. Longwell was an Austrian lady. She came from Graz, in Austria, and Jack married her in Jersey, and my mum and dad went out to Graz with Jack in an old Humber. Now this is a story in itself, that this old Humber is the crankshaft and the bearings. Jack had done it all up this car. It was a real old timer, shall we say 1928, 1930 model, but it's quite a comfortable old car. And they drove all the way to Graz. But by the time they got to Graz, the bearings on the engine collapsed, and Jack had to drop the crankshaft and remetal the bearings in Graz. And coming back, he wouldn't dare drive the car very fast. So they drove back, which was nearly, I suppose, a couple of 1,000 miles at a 30 mile an hour. And of course, my mum and dad and Jack weren't very good friends after driving back. It took them 3 or 4 days to get back to Jersey. And I met them at the harbour. It was quite funny when I look back. That was one episode that my mum and dad would never forget. Now that my mum and dad came out to Margaret and I's wedding and Margaret had arrived. My mum and dad arrived before they got on a boat, my mum and dad, which came through to Cape Town. And then the boat carried on through the Suez Canal and around that, through the Med and back to England. But they got off at Cape Town. And they got off, say, on the Thursday. And Margaret arrived the next day in the evening. And we were married the next day at St. George's Cathedral in Cape Town. Now, I had to make all the arrangements for the wedding from WWII, the photographer and the hotel. And there were plenty of people to tell me where to stay. And we stayed at Arthur's Seat, which was a very nice hotel at that time. And the coming down from WWII in the train, it took 3 days. And I bought some beautiful grapes, the Honeyport grapes. I'll never forget them. They were absolutely gorgeous. But of course, I ate those all the way down. And you used to share a carriage in those days. You either had what they called a coupe, which would got 2 bunks in, or you bought you could go into a cheaper carriage, which you've got 6 bunks in, and it's got its own wash basin and all that in the train, in the carriage. And we got married the next day, and it was quite funny. We went up to after the wedding, the wedding breakfast was I'd got 6, I think there were 6 of us there. A chap I'd met, or the immigration officer who we invited to our reception, and another elderly gentleman, now I've forgotten his name, came to our reception. I'd shared a cabin with when I originally came out. And the wedding breakfast and our accommodation came to £4. The wedding breakfast came to £4.50 or something, and included 3 bottles of champagne. Unbelievable. In these days, when people get married, it's cost thousands and thousands of pounds. And there we got away with £4 something. Then we went up to Bulawayo by train, and Fred Harlan was the Doc Croxford's brother-in-law. He was an estate agent, and he managed to get us a flat in 4 Romana buildings. Now, this Romana buildings was a brand new flat, actually, and Margaret had these stiletto high heels. Gee, the damage she did to the floor with those, with those steel caps on the stilettos. And we got 2 beds, which I bought from where I got them from, I forget now. And I got 2 single beds, and we got her box, which she brought out with her, and which, don't know where that box is now. I think it's still in Bulawayo. And we were there at Romana Buildings for, say, 9 months. It was quite funny. It was right opposite the Southern Sun Hotel. And it was called the Victoria Hotel in those days. And there was a balcony there. And Danny Kaye, the actor, came out, was on that balcony. And from our balcony, we faced right on, and we could see Danny Kaye there. Another person I saw in Victoria, in the Victoria Hotel, once was another famous actor in I've forgotten the name of the chap, but he was from Guernsey, and I wish to heck, I've always wished I'd said hello to him, because he got a Guernsey name, and he was a famous actor in these the army game or something like that, the 4 soldiers. I've gone and forgotten that, but still. But Jersey Motor Panels, it gave me a good grounding, really. When I got to Bulawayo, my first job was at Crombie's, and I was fitting a windscreen, and I smashed it in trying to fit it. It must have cost quite a bit of money. And I smashed 2 trying to fit the windscreen. But it was due to the fact that the weather was cold at that time. When the weather's cold and shatterproof glass, they've got different windscreens to what we got in Jersey. We used to have the windscreens you had on cars here were triplex, and it was 2 pieces of glass with a piece of cellophane in between the 2 sheets glued together. And if a stone hit that, it wouldn't shatter. It just cracked. Whereas in Zimbabwe, they've got this, I don't know if you call it not shatterproof, but it used to shatter. And the theory was, when you drove a car and you went over dirty, dusty roads, and the roads were very, very bad in Zimbabwe in 1953. was if a stone hit the windscreen would just become opaque. So what you had to do was put your fists through the windscreen, otherwise you'd lose control of the car. And that happened to many people in those days because of all the windscreens. And that's what happened to these windscreens when I was trying to fit them. Because you usually, with a triplex, you can hit them on the edge with a hammer. Oh, sorry, not a hammer, with a mallet, and a rubber mallet. And it was quite normal to fit. But I smashed 2 at Crombie's. But John Love worked at Crombie's there. He was a famous motor racing driver, became a world champion, mini minor champion driver. And another chap was a motorcyclist from TT days. But they were the motorcycling crowd in Zimbabwe were very, very, or Rhodesia, they were really wonderful. They were TT riders. One of them got killed. I forgot his name now. And in fact, I think 2 of them got killed. I knew 2 of them that got killed because racing cars in those days, they were a bit flimsy and frail. In fact, I knew 3 people that got killed. Thinking back, I built a body on a special for a chap, and it was, I did the front and the back, and it got a very funny suspension on it, and the car turned over, killed him. Yeah.